In the middle of the long 19th century, the young United States had fully embraced manifest destiny, a belief that American settlers were destined by God to expand westward across the still relatively unexplored continent. The painting American Progress, made by John Gass in 1872, shows an allegorical retelling of the idea. The centerpiece shows Lady Columbia representing the United States, bringing light from the east to the west, with settlers following, but in the dark, to the left, shows those left in the way. A new state is formed from the Minnesota Territory, now simply the state of Minnesota, the 32nd to be added in the Union. Its population before numbered only around 7,000 settlers. In the next 3 years, that number would skyrocket to over 172,000. The state's rich soil and close proximity with the Great Lakes began attracting vast swaths of settlers. But for Minnesota's native inhabitants, most prominently the Dakota, this was a worrying sign of things to come. The proud Dakota-Sioux, who had inhabited the Great Lakes region for centuries, had much reason to worry. In the last decade alone, the United States had essentially forced or coerced the Dakota to sign multiple treaties from 1851 to 1858, depriving local tribes of over 24 million acres of land in return for a promised $1,666,000 in cash and annuities. These treaties also left the Dakota bands with 2 reservations, both about 70 miles long and 20 miles wide. These become known as the Upper Sioux or Yellow Medicine Agency and the Lower Sioux or Redwood Agency. The Dakota, however, were heavily dissatisfied with their new dwelling. The land was mostly open prairie, a far cry from the woodlands they preferred to hunt and fish from for hundreds of years. The federal government, out of touch with the lifestyle of the proud Dakota, expected them to farm from the prairie ground with little means to do so. In the spring of 1858, several Dakota chiefs accompanied Agent Joseph R. Brown to Washington, D.C. in an attempt to further increase the annuity payments. Instead, they would end up signing yet another pair of treaties, giving up another 1 million acres located on the north side of the Minnesota River for a fixed price by the United States Senate. However, it took 2 years for Congress to agree on granting 30 cents per acre in payment. Even then, only about half of what was promised would flow into Sioux hands. In 1861, the United States became embroiled in its bloody Civil War, a conflict between the North and South. As a northern state, Minnesota would raise one of the first regiments to fight for the Union. By 1862, that state had mustered 5 infantry regiments and some artillery units, and only the 5th Minnesota had a few companies spread thinly throughout the state. The Dakota took note that many of Minnesota's warriors were gone. The same year, other factors hastened the inevitable birth of a revolt. Minnesota is a state infamously known for its harsh winters. In 1861, the state went through one of its most devastating. All suffered from it, but the Dakota were most definitely hit the hardest. So bad that their entire population was reaching the point of starvation. Secondly, the annuities that were supposed to arrive in June of 1862 never came. The delay was caused by a slow and tardy Congress. It was not until August 16th of 1862 that $71,000 of annuities arrived in St. Paul, the state's capital. When pressed on the issue, agent trader Andrew Myrick replied, "Let them eat grass or their own dung." The Dakota became incandescent with fury. On August 17, 1862, 4 Indian men hunted along the Minnesota River. While wandering through the area, they stumbled upon the small village of Acton. There they encountered the home of Robinson Jones and his family. One of the 4 men attempted to steal some eggs from Mr. Jones' farm. Another Indian man tried to stop him, telling him that they belonged to a white man. Not wanting to be accused of cowardice, he claimed that he would shoot Robertson to prove he was not afraid of any white. The 4 Indians later met with Mr. Jones as he returned to his homestead, inviting him to a shooting competition. Mr. Jones kindly accepted as the 4 men seemed friendly, but it proved to be a facade as the 4 braves turned on him and shot Mr. Jones dead. That day's killing did not stop there, however, as the Indians also killed Mrs. Jones and several others in town. Only 2 women escaped to a nearby home and spread the word of the murders, while the 4 Indian men raced away on stolen horses. Their stories spread rapidly throughout the Dakota camp, reaching Chiefs Big Eagle and Little Crow. Unsure what was to come next, the leaders of the Lower Sioux bands met together at Little Crow's village. Word was that revolt against the United States had become inevitable. This was to many the point of no return. Even if they disapproved of the actions of the 4 men, support for a general uprising quickly grew very popular. For this, the Dakota would require a command structure, and most of the other chiefs took a liking to Little Crow, as he had experienced aiding the United States in fighting the infamous Chief Incapaduta in Iowa. However, the experienced Little Crow was not so sure. Little Crow at first scoffed at the men, saying, "Braves, you are like little children. You know not what you are doing. You are full of the white man's devil water. You are like dogs in the hot moon, when they run mad and snap at their own shadows. We are only little herds of buffaloes left scattered. The great herds that cover the plain are no more. See, the white men are like locusts. When they fly so thick, the sky is like a snowstorm. You may kill 1, 2, 10, yes, as many as the leaves in the forest yonder. And their brothers will not miss them. Kill 1, 2, 10, and 10 times 10 will come to kill you. Count your fingers all day long, and white men with guns in their hands will come and kill you faster than you can count." But even after Little Crow's protest, the chiefs agreed that it would be too late to negotiate with the whites. Even Little Crow was convinced to lead the Dakota in an uprising. That night, Dakota men prepared their weapons and gathered ammunition. The tribal leaders prepared to lead their bands to their objectives. The next day, terror would begin to sweep the Minnesota frontier. August 18th would mark the first day of the uprising. First, the Lower Sioux Agency was completely overwhelmed in a surprise attack by Chief Little Crow. Here, Agent James W. Lynn became the war's first casualty. Andrew Myrick, who earlier chastised the Dakota, would have his corpse found stuffed with grass. 13 people would lose their lives in the initial attack on the Lower Agency, and 7 more would lose their lives in flight. As the fierce Dakota continued to lay waste to the Lower Agency, survivors fled towards Fort Ridgely, the only military post so far west in Minnesota. However, Fort Ridgely was only a fort in name. It had no walls or any fortifications, only a singular barracks and a few surrounding buildings. Worse yet, it was garrisoned by only 76 men of Company B, 5th Minnesota, under Captain Marsh, a Wisconsinite veteran of the Battle of First Bull Run. However, most of his men were green. Captain Marsh first heard of the news of the revolt from a survivor named J.C. Dickinson, and even more stories arrived from streams of settlers taking refuge in Fort Ridgely. Marsh did not sit idle and sprung into action. He first dispatched a most urgent message to Lieutenant Sheehan of Company C, 5th Minnesota, who were en route to Fort Ripley on the Mississippi River. "It is absolutely necessary that you should return with your command immediately to this post. The Indians are raising hell in the Lower Agency." Captain Marsh then posted Lieutenant Thomas Gear with 26 men of the company to stay at Fort Ridgely, while he took 46 men to discover the revolt himself. As the men in Company B made their way to Redwood Ferry, they came across the burning houses and dead corpses of those who were unlucky enough to be caught in the Dakota's way. As the captain and his men arrived, an Indian man appeared from the brush. He was armed and fully clothed but did not seem to act with hostility. The man's name was White Dog, and he called for a council with Captain Marsh. Peter Quinn, Marsh's interpreter, would help translate for the Wisconsinite. But halfway through, a shot rang out. Scores of Indians appeared from their concealed positions and poured torrential fire into the company. 12 soldiers and interpreter Quinn were killed in ensuing gunfire. Yet the veteran captain managed to rally enough men for a return volley at the Indians, felling only 1 warrior. Marston took notice of how he was beginning to be cut off on 3 sides. Falling back, the men found only one escape route, a wide thicket that extended downstream for nearly 2 miles. Even here though, Indians were to be found blocking the path. The only option Marsh's company had left was to cross the river. For a moment, he bravely led his men through the current as he was recalled to be an excellent swimmer. Under fire, he managed to guide several men across until a sudden leg cramp seized him, causing him to drown despite any effort to rescue him. The most senior subordinate remaining was the 19-year-old Sergeant John F. Bishop. Amazingly, he would leave 50 men as well as 5 wounded across. From there, they would make haste for Fort Ridgely. Suddenly, another 8 men involved in the ambush also returned safely. For the Minnesotans, it was a miracle that anyone survived the ambush, but for the Dakota, it was an all-encouraging victory. As the survivors made their way back to Fort Ridgely, the upper agency then came under attack. In the ensuing chaos, most of the agency had been burned and destroyed. With its destruction, hundreds more survivors would make haste to settlements further north in the already packed Fort Ridgely, many of them with Dakota hot on their heels. Fortunately for some settlers, help would come from volunteers of the neighboring Wahpeton and Sisseton tribes, safely excavating dozens of settlers eastward. Most people were not so lucky. However, throughout the day of August 18th, it is estimated that hundreds of settlers and mixed-blood Indians were killed in the unforgiving raids on the Minnesota frontier. Few were able to fight back against such sudden and overwhelming odds. Aside from the efforts of the Upper Sioux guides, the only opposition standing in the way between the Warren Dakota and the rest of the state was Fort Ridgely and the sizable German town of New Ulm. By the end of the 18th of August, the destruction and occupation of the Sioux agencies were complete. For the Dakota, they suffered almost non-existent losses, thanks to the element of surprise. It seemed as though the revolt may drive the whites from the Minnesota Valley. The leading Little Crow was discontent with how the warriors had conducted themselves toward the white civilians. You ought not to kill women and children. Doing so makes warriors weak in battle. Those who need killing are those who have been robbing us for so long. He then argued for a concentrated assault against more strategically important targets, Fort Ridgely and New Ulm. The capture of the government post and the subsequent capture of the city of New Ulm, the largest in western Minnesota, would open up their desired objectives, the Minnesota Valley. Big Eagle agreed with Little Crow's strategy. Other prominent figures such as Chief Wabasha, however, did not, most likely out of petty jealousy they was known to have for their warrior chief. Wabasha's allies would of course take to his side, and the planned attack on the frontier outpost would not commence on the evening of August 18th. Unknowingly, this delay would probably save the fort from destruction. Fort Ridgely, as previously described, was a fort only in name. Its strongest defenses were the stone buildings surrounding the parade ground. Its magazines to the north were vulnerable and unprotected. The fort stables and other outlying buildings also remained vulnerable. As for terrain, the fort was surrounded by high ground to the north, and to the south lay two large ravines and one small gully, all which were surrounded by thick foliage. Worst of all, Gear now only had around 49 soldiers, most of which were in poor physical condition. The 20-year-old lieutenant could spare none of these men to perform picket duty. That job would fall to a few armed citizens who lacked the military discipline to perform. To take care of the refugees, he packed all of them into the stone barracks. Gear also dispatched another rider to catch up with Lieutenant Sheehan, who had been hard marching his men for 2 days toward Fort Ripley. Incredibly, the fast riding corporal would quickly catch up to the lieutenant and hand him a message from Greer stating, "Captain Marsh and most of his command were killed yesterday. 250 refugees are at the fort. The Indians are killing men, women, and children." Without hesitation, the exhausted Sheehan and his men would douse their fires, pack their tents, and march before midnight. On the morning of the 19th, Little Crow began rousing his warriors for battle just as Sheehan was less than 10 miles away. Just as the Indian braves began advancing, Little Crow received frightening news from George Quinn, related to the interpreter killed at Redwood Ferry, who told him that a great number of soldiers were in close proximity to the fort. The news startled Little Crow enough to postpone the attack. Indeed, Sheehan did arrive by the afternoon of August 19th with Company C of the 5th Minnesota, bringing the fort's number of defenders to over 100. Later that night, they would also receive help from the Renville Rangers, a unit formed up of mixed-blood Indians and white volunteers. Thanks to the Herculean marching done by Sheehan, the fort had been possibly saved from destruction. However, the Dakota were not ready to leave. 40 more of their mounted men had arrived from west of New Ulm to aid Little Crow, who had decided to attack the next day. In the early morning of August 20th, Sheehan now took over command of the fort. Almost as soon as the American men were roused for battle, Chief Little Crow, with Mikado, Big Eagle, and around 400 warriors had surrounded the fort. Little Crow himself started the first assault from the southwestern side where his men would overrun the stables. To Little Crow's frustration, the men who occupied them competed for the acquisition of the horses, greatly slowing the charge's momentum. Little Crow would manage to rally his men and instead use the stable as a cover for another attack. But at this point, the Minnesota soldiers could easily see the Indians and knew exactly what they were planning. One of these men, Sergeant Jones, a skilled artilleryman, was one of them. He personally wheeled his gun over to the southern edge of the fort where he'd fire an exploding cannonball over the stables, instantly setting them ablaze and driving the Indians out of them. Before retreating, the archers responded by shooting fire-tipped arrows from their bows, successfully setting fire to the shingled-top roof of one of the buildings. But for the rest of the afternoon on the southwest flank, fighting devolved into back-and-forth skirmishing. But as the attack in the southwest withered, a large band of warriors, possibly under Big Eagle Mikado, charged the log houses just immediately north of the stone barracks, quickly driving out the few soldiers posted to them with a terrifying cry of their war whoop. They then turned their attention onto the barracks packed with refugees. A young Esmond Earl, an armed survivor, wrote about the ferocity with which the Dakota attacked. It seemed as though pandemonium itself had broken loose. The war whoops was worse, and I think I dodged more often for them rather than the bullets. Immediately fighting outside the barracks put the refugees into a panic as they flooded into the second story. Many of the armed civilian men did so as well. There was singing, praying, crying, and screaming, said one unknown soldier. Two artillery crews under Sergeant James G. McGrew and a Mexican War veteran, John Whipple, moved their pieces to both sides of the barracks, firing a few rounds to the Indian braves. The exploding rod and balls, as the Indians nicknamed them, caused the warriors to scatter in confusion. At least 3 of them were killed and several more wounded. One unfortunate American soldier had also been caught in the fire and killed. By the later afternoon, the gunfire had died down. The fort had held despite the Minnesotans being outnumbered by at least 600 men. Lieutenant Sheehan, who bravely fought alongside his men, suffered a flesh wound. It was major enough to leave 2nd Lieutenant Gear in overall command once more. By August 22nd, Governor Ramsey had been well aware of the revolt for a few days. During that time, he was not idle at all. Even with 4 of the state's regiments fighting in the south, he prioritized the formation of several new regiments as well as the formation of some civilian militia. These included elements of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Minnesota Infantry Regiments, as well as the mounted Colon Frontier Guards. Some of the regiments were hastily formed on the spot with a lack of uniforms, training, ammunition, and proper equipment. The man appointed to lead the small relief army would be none other than Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley. Having lived in Minnesota as a tradesman long before the state joined the Union. However, Sibley lacked military experience. Nonetheless, Sibley gathered his rookie soldiers and marched them from Fort Snelling, but upon further inspection of the men, he delayed his advance. The men's weapons were older and outdated, rejected by the army for their questionable quality and sent to the frontier arsenals. Most of the ammunition proved too large a caliber for the rifles provided. Sibley requested for much better weapons, which would take time for him to receive. Fortunately, he would receive enough brand new Springfield rifles just in time to bring the 6th Minnesota to the settlement of St. Peter just outside Fort Ridgely, which would come under another assault on the 23rd. At 1 p.m. that day, the Dakota charged on Fort Ridgely, again starting from the battered southwest corner. Overnight, Little Crow had received 300 reinforcements, bolstering his army to 800 or so men. Indian braves on all sides surrounded the point and fired upon it, but the 2 companies of the 5th with the Rangers held firm still. Little Crow bravely urged his warriors forward, but he was grazed on the chest by one of Sergeant Jones' cannonballs. He fell severely wounded, being carried back to the Indian camp. For the Dakota, it was a severe blow to morale. The charge dithered, and sub-chiefs such as Big Eagle had to take over command of the battle, but not even his encouragement could bring the braves within reach of the fort's interior. As they were compelled to fall back, the northwestern corner of the fort came under torrential fire and many screaming warriors. Sergeant McGrew saw the second attack coming and maneuvered his cannon at the braves. His cannon belched flame as a ball soared over a large group of Indians and scattered them with the explosion, killing a number of them and wounding many more. One of Sergeant Jones' guns firing at the same men instead fired directly into the crowd, having the same effect. The Dakota then scattered in all directions. still unused to the fire of the rotten balls. The 23rd would see a repeat of the previous assault in which both sides would engage in a dithering skirmish. Despite the gallant efforts of the Indian braves, they never quite closed the distance between themselves and the frontier soldiers. While Fort Ridgely's garrison remained on high alert for more efforts by the Dakota, another band of 350 warriors led by Little Crow made a second attack on New Ulm. There, the Dakota braves hoped to make a breakthrough of the settlement's poor defenses. Luckily, the city's garrison was reinforced by 90 militia under Captain Charles Flandreau. There he found 1,500 panicking refugees in the Germanic town. He immediately set his men to work and heavily fortified the town, which came under attack later on the 23rd. At first, the Dakota bands held the initiative, quickly beating the pickets back from the outer defenses on the prairie. They then charged into the city streets, pouring fire into the backs of Flandreau's men. It seemed as though the battle was lost, until Flandreau and his reserves sallied out from the outbuildings and turned the Indians back. Although New Ulm had miraculously held, Flandreau's men were running low on ammunition. He was also convinced that Fort Ridgely had been taken, due to the visible fire started there. On the 25th, the survivors excavated unharassed in Mankato. It was a melancholy spectacle to see 2,000 people, who a few days before had been prosperous and happy, be reduced to utter beggary. Captain Charles Eugene Flandreau on the march to Mankato. Finally, on the 26th of August, Sibley arrived at Fort Ridgely with the 6th Minnesota Infantry Regiment. 3 days later, another column of volunteers reoccupied New Ulm on the 29th to the scenes of utter destruction. Most of the frontier would suffer the same fate. But the North Star State's defenses were slowly becoming more organized. Their arrival in the next few days would bolster Sibley's army at Fort Ridgely to 1,200 men. Lastly, Sibley also learned of the 3rd Minnesota's infantry return after a humbling surrender at the Battle of Murfreesboro in the south. Of course, he would urge Governor Ramsey to have them arrive as soon as possible. At the moment, Sibley had no idea where Little Crow's bands had retired to, or where they were concentrated. His army remained in desperate need of fitting ammunition, bread, and uniforms, but for now, Minnesota's last line of defense had held. In the next coming weeks, Sibley gained enough strength to go on the offensive. Little Crow's men would be waiting.